2, 1, going live.
Is that working?
It should be,
Alright, cool.
should be working. Give it a
Oh,
moment.
what the fuck? It like cuts out my head.
You're
That's
just in
weird.
that pale. Alright. YouTube should be taking that stuff shortly.
Well, it definitely is because I hear it in your voice.
Oh.
I'm assuming it's launching right now.
It has launched. Yeah, cool. Great. Hi guys. We're still waiting. Oh, let's here. Admit.
Oh, perfect.
A little bit choppy. I'm sorry about that. My laptop is not necessarily the best at maintaining things. Hi, Melissa.
Hello. Oh, she's muted.
Yeah, you're muted. This is going. Yeah. Melissa, you are currently muted if you are trying to say anything, so we can't hear you.
Okay.
Right,
Sorry,
cool,
I don't. It, yeah.
No worries.
It just automatically mutes me, and then I don't. It, yeah.
Yeah. Well, hey,
Zoom.
we're all here together now. I've got the stream up on YouTube. We're live. Everything's great. We have these snazzy virtual backgrounds going on. Although arguably they do more harm than good.
Yeah, no, they don't really work.
Yeah.
Yeah, they can look a little weird and a little too virtual sometimes.
A little bit too virtual. I mean, look, my
Yeah.
hand just phases out of existence sometimes. It's great.
Kind of cross my hair. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, we got 2 people watching at the moment. We'll hopefully rack up. Oh, we got 4 now. We're racking them up. Cool. I will start doodling. So yeah, hello guys. The format of this stream is going to be a pretty standard like Q&A. We've got Melissa Amarello here, and we're just going to go and introduce ourselves first. So I guess I will go first since people know me. Then we'll go Melissa and then Miles. Hi guys, I'm Emma. You may also know me as Hasio. I run this art channel. I do drawing, and as you know, I'm very passionate about snakes and reptiles. So it's only fitting that I invited a couple friends on to talk about snakes today. Which would lead us to Melissa.
Sure. So I'm Melissa Amarello. I am one of the co-founders and the executive director of Advocates for Snake Preservation, which is a nonprofit organization that is working to change how people view and treat snakes. And we use science and education and outreach and advocacy to do that.
Hi, my name is Miles. I'm one of Emma's friends. I don't really have any qualifications in the same way, but I like the natural world and by extent snakes, so I'm going to be relaying your questions to Melissa.
All right, and without further ado, if anybody has questions, oh, we got someone who just says snake, snake, snake in the chat. If you have any questions, please do ask them through the chat, and I am taking commissions, I suppose. You guys can send donations to the Advocates to Snake Preservation through their website, which is shown in the text below, and I will draw something for you if you choose to donate. So why don't we start off with a couple of the questions we had written down earlier, and just wait for them to pick up as they go. Got someone from Germany, I think. It's pretty cool.
This is probably a good background question, but how did you become interested in studying snakes?
Yeah, I think I was a pretty typical kid for a while. I was really into dinosaurs. Those were the books that I read when I first started reading, and just was like kind of obsessed with them. But at the same time, like I liked live animals. You know, we had a dog. I loved our dog. And so my interest in dinosaurs started to wane a little bit because, you know, they're extinct, and looking at bones and digging for bones didn't interest me as much as actually getting to observe the behavior of a living animal. So I kind of shifted from dinosaurs to alligators and crocodiles. And because I didn't live someplace where I could go see them, except like in a zoo, which is not that exciting, my dad found a garter snake in our backyard one day in the garden, and he let me hold her, and I asked if I could keep her, and he said yes. And although we didn't keep her for very long because she didn't really care for being in a cage too much and didn't eat well, so we let her go. But I just fell in love with her, and kind of learned as I went along that not everybody feels that way about snakes. They're kind of an underdog. A lot of people don't like them. A lot of people are really scared of them. It's always nice to like talk to other people who are into snakes. But because I realized that they weren't so well liked, later when I got into science and studying snakes and especially working on their conservation, I realized that conservation is really hard to do on an animal that is disliked. And so that's how we came around to forming this organization and focusing on snakes in this way instead of just studying them.
We don't really have any questions in chat, but we do have one comment of someone's sister finding a snake shed outside, which I personally love that. At my grandparents' house, they have a shed in their backyard that I think like 3 garters inhabit. So that's kind of cool.
Awesome. Yeah, it's fun to find sheds like in your yard, because that means, you know, when snakes are getting ready to shed their skin, they're pretty vulnerable because they can't see well, and so they want to find like a place where they feel safe and is a safe, good spot for them. So I think that's a really good sign when you find one in your yard, because that means that your yard is a safe place for wildlife.
All right, next question. Talking about safe places, do snakes have friends?
Yeah. So this is a hot topic. Last year, a study came out on garter snakes, and a lot of the titles in newspapers and stuff that covered it was snakes have friends. And my partner, Jeff Smith, and I, the other co-founder of Advocates for Snake Preservation, we did a study, we started it like 10 years ago, on Arizona black rattlesnakes, looking at their social behavior. And I think a lot of people think of snakes, you know, again, because of the negative way they're usually portrayed in the media and even in like nature documentaries and stuff, that, you know, they just assume that snakes are mean, they wouldn't like to be around each other. But a lot of snakes, if they use a den over the winter, so in cooler places where they can't be active all year, they go away for the winter, and they usually go underground. And in some places they'll do that in groups. And sometimes the reason that they congregate in large numbers over the winter is pretty clear, that it has to do with, it's a very cold place where the ground is frozen, and there's just very few places where they can overwinter and they're not going to freeze to death. And so sometimes that will cause large numbers of snakes to hang out together. And that was actually the classic example of that, is a very large den of garter snakes in Canada, where there are just like tens of thousands at this one site. But we worked in the Southwest, in Arizona, where it doesn't get that hot. I'm sorry, it doesn't get that cold. It definitely gets that hot. But over the winter, it doesn't get that cold. Freezing to death is not really an issue. But they'll still den, and we realized that they were still denning in groups. And so we thought there was something else maybe going on with that. And so we used some of the scientific methods, social network analysis, and association indices that people have used to study kind of more traditionally social animals like birds and elephants, and like dolphins and some primates. And we applied that to our groups of snakes at the den to look at who was hanging out and basking on the surface with who. And we found that indeed they don't just come and hang out with just whatever other snake happens to be up that day. They're making choices, and they do have friends. We found that certain pairs of snakes spent much more time with each other than they did with any other snake that shared that den, and much more so than you would expect if they were just like, you know, random. So if you just like threw all the snakes up in the air and just saw where they landed, that's not how they typically hang out. And, you know, it used to be when I told this story, my example for snakes that were denning that was maybe not because they were having friends and not because they were social were garter snakes, because they're in these really cool places, really cold places. But the study that was published last year found that within those groups, similar to our Arizona black rattlesnakes, the garter snakes are also making choices and preferring to be around specific snakes, and just in general, even when they have other places where they could be alone, they prefer to be in groups. So it turns out that at least in 2 species of snakes, and because those 2 species of snakes aren't really closely related, we expect that we'll see it in other species too when people start looking, that they do have friends and they are kind of social.
We have another kind of like anecdote, I guess, from the chat. Someone once found a sedge viper, which I didn't know was a species, but I'm kind of scared of it because apparently it's extremely toxic, or venomous rather. So that's kind of interesting. Pretty snake though.
Yeah. Some of the, I'm most familiar with rattlesnakes as far as venomous snakes goes. And they're a type of viper, they're pit vipers. But yeah, some of the vipers that live elsewhere in the world are just, some of them really gorgeous. I'm not familiar with that species. I'm gonna have to Google it.
Yeah.
I have a
field skill.
Yeah, my research mentor actually was bitten by a bush viper before. One of the genus Atherus. It was a really pretty snake. The scales stick up, like it looks like a dragon almost. And he got bitten, and he actually wrote a paper about the effects of the venom. And when you get that high up into science, that tends to happen.
Yeah, that's not the only story I've heard of somebody who got bit and then took very careful notes and turned it into a little publication.
Yeah, Carl Schmidt in the boom slang, I think he died from it, but that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
We do have one question in the chat, and it's how do snakes' social hierarchies work outside of smaller friend groups, and if they have any?
It's a very good question. So outside of the pairs of friends, the garter snake paper, and we also found this in ours that there did seem to be. So we didn't look for, and I don't think the garter snake group did either. At least they didn't report on it in their publication. A hierarchical structure, so meaning that there's somebody in charge and then middle management, that kind of hierarchy. But aside from just the pairs, both of those studies, we found that there were cliques. So little groups of snakes that tended to, outside of these pairs that were friends, that just tended to be out together. And those groups weren't always composed of, all the pregnant females or all the males or all the babies. They were mixed groups of all of the different kinds of snakes that we had hanging out. So cliques were the only sort of thing. It didn't, without doing an investigation, there didn't seem to be any evidence of hierarchies, but, this is so far also only been looked at in 2 of the 3,000 species of snakes.
This kind of ties in, but do snakes take care of their babies?
They do. Some of them do, at least as far as we know. So snakes and other reptiles, a lot of them lay eggs. Some of them also give birth to live young. And actually the egg layers, some of those build nests. Some of them build nests communally. Some of them will guard those eggs and their nests from potential predators and other threats. So they do some sort of care of the eggs too. Now, as far as we know, I haven't heard of any observations with most egg-laying snakes where anything happens after they hatch. And an exception to that is African rock python. And the mother continues to stay. She helps, think about pythons and constricting when they are getting ready to kill something to eat it. They also kind of hug their eggs in the nest like that too. And they do this shivering behavior, some of them, to keep them warm, which is another type of care. And then in that species, when the eggs hatch, the mom will actually go on the surface and get warm while her babies stay in the shelter underground. And then she'll come back in and share that warmth with their babies, because snakes, like other non-avian reptiles, are cold-blooded or ectothermic, which means that they depend on their environment for heat. They can't produce their own body heat. So So that is an important resource for the babies who don't need to eat yet because they just hatched, so they still have nutrition from their yolk. So that's one way that some snakes care for their babies. Rattlesnakes are probably the most well-known group that takes care of their babies. They give birth to live young. So after an extended pregnancy of months in which they've been sharing nutrition with the babies as they're growing inside them, the mother and the babies will stay together until about 10 to 14 days. It depends on the species, but it's until the babies shed their skin for the first time. And during that time, we've seen some evidence that perhaps they're also doing that heat sharing thing with the babies. We didn't have infrared cameras and didn't have the ability to look underground to confirm it like they did with the rock pythons, but it certainly looks like that's what is going on. And you'll also see just the presence of a large adult rattlesnake around these little babies. The little babies have lots of predators, lots of things that can get them. Also, they're just like a lot of young animals, kind of stupid and don't know what they're doing. So it's helpful to have an adult there to make sure they don't just go like crawling out into the sun or crawling over to this dumb human that's sitting there watching them with binoculars that could be a threat. So that's the kind of care we see and be able to confirm with them so far. Snakes mostly swallow their food whole, so feeding and sharing food isn't something that we would expect to see, and as far as I know, hasn't been observed yet.
Let's see. Redstorm asks, do snakes have any symbiotic relationships with other animals?
Oh, that is a very good question. I'm not sure. I cannot remember reading about a symbiotic relationship between a snake and another species of animal. So I'm going to say that I don't know, but I don't think so. I feel like I would have remembered if that come up. But yeah, that's a good one. Very interesting.
What else do we have? We have, do you think snakes make friends based on their personalities?
Lots of good questions from this group. I don't know. So I think when we did our study on the rattlesnakes, we presented it at a few scientific meetings, but we haven't actually published that in a journal, and that's something that we're wanting to do this year. And we're looking for different ways to examine our data than the very basic thing we did before, which was just like, are they social or are they a big random pile of snakes? And personalities is something that I have thought about that would be interesting to look at. And so I don't know the answer to that question, but I think that is a very good idea that's probably going to take to see if we have data to answer that, if there are similar personalities like within these cliques of snakes. Oh, thank you. So I was just handed a note by my partner at Advocates for Snake Preservation about symbiotic relationships between snakes, and I can't believe I forgot about this one because it's between a snake and another animal that I love a whole lot. So it's screech owls and thread snakes. So screech owls are pretty small little predator birds. They're owls, they're nocturnal. And they eat lots of tiny things, but one of the many little things that they eat are small snakes. But, and it took scientists a while to figure out that this was more than just an accident. They will bring back thread snakes live to their nest and leave them in their nest. And the helpfulness of that is if you think about a predatory animal that's like multiple times every day or every night bringing back dead animals to feed to its babies, and birds are like super messy eaters, they're just shredding everything, then you end up with a nest, and especially if you're a cavity nester like a screech owl, it's going to get really gross in there, and you can have like an overgrowth of insects, and some of those insects are going to be parasites on the babies. that are, you know, not going to be good for their survival. So thread snakes eat invertebrates. And so they think that the screech owls have learned, and it probably did start off by accident with one that just, you know, got into all that nesting material at the bottom of the nest before anybody could eat them. But now they tend to keep thread snakes alive in their nest to take care of some of those invertebrates that could be parasites for the babies. So that is an example of a symbiotic relationship.
Another question. How often do snakes breed? And you can specify to maybe like rattlesnakes or whatever you're familiar with.
Yeah. So some snakes do, you know, once they're adult size, will lay eggs or give birth, whatever it is that they do every year. I don't think there are any examples of snakes that do it more than once a year, because it's generally snakes tend to, you know, they're kind of a low energy system. They don't eat very often, and they're just all about conserving energy. So for females, having babies or eggs is a big expenditure of energy, and it would be hard for them to do even if they didn't hibernate over the winter, to do that more than once a year. It's such a big investment, in fact, that in most rattlesnakes, they'll only give birth every 2 years, some of them only 3 years. If it's crappy weather, like, they may skip even more than that. I think in timber rattlesnakes in the northeastern U.S., it's more common for them to go up to 5 years in between litters of babies.
What else do we have? This one is about how snakes are portrayed in the media. Is what's something that you dislike / like about how some snakes or reptilians are portrayed, specifically in TV shows or movies?
Well, I would have to think. It's really hard to find an example of a snake portrayed in a TV show or a movie that I like. You know, whenever I meet someone who, you know, tells me that they're scared of snakes, especially someone else that grew up in the United States, that, you know, they're scared of snakes, or they just, you know, they just get the creepy crawlies because they just have these feelings that they're evil and they're apologizing. And I just, you know, I get that, because that is how they're portrayed over and over again in almost all TV shows and movies. Every Western always has a scene where the cowboy, like, comes across the rattlesnake, and of course the rattlesnake's rattling, and we're supposed to say, I mean, what you learn in a Western TV is, like, that's what they do before they attack people, and attack people is something that they do all the time, even though they have no reason to do that, because we're way too big for them to eat. Like I said, they swallow their food whole, so there are no rattlesnakes big enough to swallow even the tiniest human and the biggest rattlesnake. So they're portrayed negatively over and over again. You know, often it's just anytime somebody comes across a snake in the wild, the snake is on the attack. People are often, you know, they use a snake and somebody killing a snake to show that that person is heroic, or, you know, being a good protector of their family. I've seen that a couple times on TV shows that, you know, otherwise had nothing to do with snakes. You know, sometimes they're used as a symbol of evil and bad things. And so I think a really good current-ish example of that is the Harry Potter series. And I love those books and I love those movies, but, you know, evil wizards were associated with snakes. That was like the symbol of Slytherin. The name is Slytherin. A lot of them could talk to snakes, and that was viewed as like indication that you were probably an evil wizard. So yeah, there's not a lot positive, and even when it's a nature documentary, so something on National Geographic or the BBC, well, the BBC tends to be a little better, and some of them, like anything on Animal Planet or Discovery, is going to be really bad about this. They tend to focus on the negative and scary aspects of snakes. So who's the biggest? who's the most dangerous. I mean, there've been so many like top 10 most deadly snakes in the world, which are always different because that's a very difficult thing to say who's the most dangerous. And they'll show them as predators, but they leave out everything else about them. And the fact that some of them are venomous, but it's a pretty small percentage of all those species of snakes. And it's like, yes, they're predators, but like I said, they don't eat that often. And so that's, maybe 10% of their lives is spent like killing something. And there's so many other things that they could talk about that we know about snakes and that we've known about snakes for a long time, but they just tend to focus on this negative stuff. So yeah, I wish I had more examples. I've seen some beautiful poems that people have written where snakes are just kind of there. And those are probably the most positive portrayals of snakes that I've seen in media, not TV shows and movies, unfortunately.
One that I remember is from that movie Rango.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, the rattlesnake. Yeah. Kind of like the main villain or main antagonist.
Yeah. Yep. There was Ka in the Jungle Book, who's like, trickery, and it's never good.
Let's see. Well, someone asked, they gave a little like background information on it, but they said, in school I learned that snakes are extremely important because they play the role of predators, and are both predators and prey. Is that true? And what are the natural predators of snakes?
Yeah, so it is true. They are both predators and prey. So, again, when we're talking about snakes, we're talking about over 3,000 different species. And you have some like thread snakes, which are these little tiny like girth of a piece of dry spaghetti, or a pencil and just a few inches long, these little tiny guys. And then you also have animals like female green anacondas, which can weigh up to 300 pounds, and everything in between. So depending on which side of that size spectrum you're on, you're going to be more often a predator or more often prey. But as far as we know, all snakes are carnivorous, and depending on who they are, they might eat insects and other invertebrates like those thread snakes, although some bigger snakes eat invertebrates too, even some that are, like decent size, like racers. This place we worked in coastal California, during particular times of the year, their diet seemed to be almost 100% grasshoppers and crickets. And we knew that's what they're eating because that was also blackberry season. And the grasshoppers and the crickets were eating a lot of blackberries, and so they would kind of turn purple, and then the snakes would poop purple. So we could see that that's what they were eating.
That's interesting.
Little purple grasshopper legs and stuff. And then, of course, snakes are pretty famous for eating mammals like mice. That's what everybody feeds their pet snakes. They eat a lot of different mammals. Some of them eat birds. There are snakes that specialize on fish, especially ones that tend to live in rivers and lakes and near other bodies of water. Obviously, you need to live in or near a body of water to specialize on fish. Some snakes specialize in eating other snakes. The common king snake and the king cobra are two pretty well-known examples of snakes that mostly eat other snakes. I mean, king snakes will eat other stuff too, but they're pretty famous for eating other snakes. And lizards, I mean, pretty much, if with a few exceptions of snakes that are specialists, a lot of them, if they can fit it in their mouth, they'll eat it. And so that can include things as big as deer and caimans, which are a type of crocodile, for some of the bigger snakes. But then for some of the others, that just means like scorpions and ants and stuff. Oh, and predators. That was the other part of that. Yeah. So same deal. Like depending on how big you are, you're going to have, different predators or way fewer of them. So something like a green anaconda, the smaller ones of those, they're also predated by those same caimans that bigger ones eat. Also, larger predatory mammals, like depending on where you live, I imagine lions sometimes eat snakes, mongoose and other in countries where mongoose live eat snakes and weasels, and a lot of the mammals in that family, not specialized, but tend to hunt a lot of snakes. A lot of predatory birds will eat snakes, and being a venomous snake doesn't exempt you from any of those things. Like, I know that rattlesnakes are predated upon by coyotes, raccoons, fox, badgers, mountain lions, bobcats, pretty much any bird of prey, hawk or eagle that lives near where they do. The owls, like I said before, even a tiny little screech owl, they kill and eat their fair share of other snakes. If they're an aquatic snake, a big fish might eat them. A snapping turtle might eat a snake. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of everything. They have this really neat place, as it's, depending on where they are and who else they're living with, that they're both an important source of food for a lot of animals, and also an important predator that's providing a check to keep some other animals from getting out of balance by doing their job and eating them.
Talking about specialized diets too. I've had one experience with the species called a northern water snake when I was younger. Emma's drawing kind of reminded me of it because they look a little similar. I was fishing off of a dock when I think I was about 7 years old, and I either caught a sunfish or a small bass. And I remember this black snake leaping out of the water and grabbing it off of my hook.
Oh, that's so cool.
As I was bringing it up, which was actually pretty interesting to watch, but it might have seemed larger than it actually was because of my age, but it was a little intimidating.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. There's a, man, I would have to, I mean, if you Googled around, you could probably find it. There is an adorable video of this, older middle-aged man who at his favorite fishing spot, and I've since then heard from other people that they do this. Water snakes do learn about fishing and what that could mean for them as far as a meal. But anyways, this particular video, this guy brings out a bucket of fish with him to this little dock, and these water snakes are crawling up out of the water, some of them, and onto the dock, and sort of almost looking like a cobra, coming up his legs so he can hand them fish, and they're taking fish out of his hand. And the video is just, it's adorable. He's talking to them like you talk to your dog, like I talk to snakes, they're your dog or your cat.
I put the link in chat. I think I found it.
Yeah.
Ah, cool.
And also, just a quick little question. I got curious, because you were talking about the ecology of snakes and whether their impacts as predator and prey can do certain things. Have you ever heard of a circumstance or instance where a snake was a keystone predator or animal, or a keystone species of an environment?
I don't recall seeing any papers like that, and I don't know if that is because it's not something that people have looked at all, or just that from the get-go, I think most people, when they think of keystones, they immediately go towards a large mammal or a bird. So I don't know if that's why, if it just hasn't been looked at that way in snakes, just because of our own study biases. I mean, that's the case with a lot of other things, like the social behavior of snakes. I think the only reason that's new discoveries in the last 10 years is just everyone assumed they were not capable, so they didn't bother looking. And so I'm wondering if that's the same thing, because I don't recall seeing any papers about that, but I'm guessing that there is an ecosystem out there somewhere where they are the keystone.
Let's see. Am I muted? No, good. We have another question in chat. In your opinion, what is the most interesting species of snake?
Okay. Man, so I don't have a lot of experience with most species of snakes that exist, because I have very little experience with captives, so my knowledge is kind of limited, to specifics as far as what makes them interesting to ones that live in the U.S. and mostly in the southwestern U.S., because that's where I've spent most of my professional career. So the one here that I think is by far the most interesting are Arizona black rattlesnakes. And so I already talked a little bit about that we studied their social behavior. And that was kind of almost the last sort of interesting piece, or the most recent. I'm sure there's some interesting stuff that we haven't discovered yet. But Arizona black rattlesnakes are not that well known outside of this part of the country. I think, Western diamondbacks or just diamondbacks are really well known. Of course, timber rattlesnakes, because that's the most common species in the East. So a lot of people that live in that part of the country, that's what they think of when they think of a rattlesnake. And timber rattlesnakes actually share a lot of behaviors with Arizona black rattlesnakes, including some of the social behaviors, and they also take care of their babies. So in addition to being social and having these interactions at dens that we were able to document and study, and they take care of their babies, that was the species that I first got to observe personal care in. And with some of our remote time-lapse cameras, we also got to film interactions between mother rattlesnakes with squirrels attacking their nests, and also some Arizona black rattlesnakes at dens interacting with squirrels. And that was the first one I got to see that, which was pretty interesting. But one of the first things about Arizona black rattlesnakes, actually the thing that initially drew my attention to them, is that they change color. So they start off as babies, very light gray with dark brown blotches. And as they get older, they get darker. And in some places, when they are quite a few years old, so maybe not until they're 7 or 8 years old, they will be almost jet black. So as they age, they get darker. That's called an ontogenetic color shift. And there's a lot of snakes that do that will change color and pattern as they get older. The special part about Arizona black rattlesnakes color change is that the adults can also change color within minutes. So that's physiological color change, which means there's actually things happening within their skin cells that are changing color. So kind of like a chameleon, they're not quite as fast. And physiologically, it's a different system that chameleons use to change color, that most chameleons use to change color versus rattlesnakes. But those same dark black adult Arizona black rattlesnakes can fade to look almost like the babies again. And the first time I saw that, we were catching snakes, and we put a black Arizona black rattlesnake in a bag, and then took her back to where we were going to measure her and stuff. When we got her out of the bag, it was like a completely different snake. It was like somebody played a joke, because it was this drab gray animal, like what happened to that pretty black snake that we caught a few minutes ago. So we don't know why they do this. The obvious thing, the thing that we thought, was that it must have to do with heat. Black, dark colors. Anyone who's ever been out in the sun in a black t-shirt or pants knows how much hotter you get. So we assumed that was why they changed color. That's why there are some other lizards that go from dark to light, and it seems like it's a temperature thing. But we didn't actually find any evidence of that, and we weren't finding any evidence of the color change being related to anything, which is actually one of the reasons we shifted to studying social behavior. So I don't have any answers for that. But yeah, I think that's another thing about them that makes them really interesting, is they do this crazy thing and we don't know why.
Let's see. We have another question. Why do some snakes give live birth while others lay eggs?
Good question. So the general theory among lizards and snakes as to why, because there are some lizards who give live birth to, even within closely related groups. So horned lizards, which are the well-known little guys, live in the Southwest U.S. and Mexico, that shoot blood out of their eyes, which actually only some of them do. Within that group, there are some horned lizards that give birth to live babies, and there are some that lay eggs. With snakes, it's much bigger groups that lay eggs versus live birth. And the general idea is that in a cooler place, it's easier to basically carry your eggs around with you. So live birth. And so just thinking about like if you are going to lay eggs someplace, you know, and I think you're probably familiar with like a bird that's sitting on eggs, because birds are warm-blooded, they're endothermic, so they produce their own body heat. So they can sit on their eggs and share that body heat with their eggs really easily and keep them at the correct temperature they need to be until they hatch. So if you are an ectotherm or cold-blooded, unless you're one of those pythons that does that shivering thing to produce some heat for their egg, you are dependent on finding the right spot in the environment that is going to get warm enough, but not too warm, because of course you can get eggs too warm, and then you have cooked eggs, scrambled eggs, and that's not helpful for hatching and having babies. So you've got to find just the right spot. And so the idea is that as you move up in latitude, so move towards one of the poles, either towards the North Pole or to the South Pole, depending on what side of the equator you're on, where it's going to be cooler, or up in elevation into the mountains, you tend to see more of them giving live birth, because then you have the ability to move around. So in the morning, I can go sit out in this sunny open rock, and then when it starts getting too hot for me and my baby's developing inside me, then I can move into the shade, and you know, tomorrow I can move somewhere else, if that makes sense. It's not like lines you can draw, and it's like, oh, all the species above this line or below this line do one thing or another. And I could list for you a lot of examples of high elevation snakes that, you know, lay eggs and don't give live birth. But that's the general trend with that. And yeah, it's interesting, and it's a, you know, it's one of those that has been developed in different lineages. So there's not like a lineage of live birth snakes or lizards. Like the group of lizards that snakes evolved from, those are mostly egg, or maybe entirely egg layers. So it's something that continues to go back and forth with eggs versus live birth. It's pretty interesting.
So, personal question. Are there snakes within the same family that change live birth and egg-wise? Like closely related, but still give differences?
Good question. So, I don't think so. I don't think there's an example left of horned lizards. So the ones that I know that give, let's see, boas are live-bearing, rattlesnakes, and almost all of the New World vipers, the pit vipers, are live-bearing, except for one in Central and South America that lays eggs. And I think it is still in the same. I think it is still the same family as some of the other live-bearing ones. So that may be the only example of one that retained the eggs or switched back or whatever. I'm not sure. All the garter snakes, live birth. I don't know that much about sea snakes because I've never lived and worked someplace where we encounter them. But I know that some sea snakes lay eggs and some sea snakes do live birth. But I think there's also more than one family of sea snakes. So that may be how that's divided up.
Okay. Next question is on reproductive strategy. And will male and female snakes both take care of the babies, or will the male mate with several females?
Good question. So based on what has been observed so far, both the male and female snakes mate with multiple others. So a lot of times in a single litter of snakes, or of rattlesnakes, this is the one that's been best studied, and the closely related copperheads that you have in the eastern U.S., you can have up to 5 different dads. And it could be more than that. That's just the most that I know of that's been documented. So they're both promiscuous, is what we call that. So in that sense, it doesn't, the male could never be sure unless they have some other way of telling, and maybe they do, that the babies at that nest are his, even if he did mate with that female, because she could have had several other in the meantime. And just even though they can have multiple dads in the same litter, not every snake that breeds with that female is necessarily going to be the dad of her babies the following year. So in this one study that documented up to 5 dads of one litter, they also a couple times observed snakes, not just courting, but actually copulating. But the babies that female gave birth to the next year didn't come from that male. So that's one of the things that's going on with that. So we have observed males attending nests of baby rattlesnakes, and just sort of same way we've seen some pregnant females and some other helpers doing some, we call it babysitting, even when it's the males, because we don't know, we haven't done the DNA on everybody to know if he's related, if he's the dad. It could be he just wanted to hang out there. He could be their uncle. He could be not related at all. So I don't think anyone has observed a male snake taking care of babies that they knew for sure was at least somebody's dad. But males do occasionally show up and are part of this dynamic of multiple mothers and not mothers, and mothers to be, and juvenile snakes that are around the nest when the babies are born and help take care of them.
This is a question I have that kind of branches off, but do you know of any species that have lifelong partners?
I don't know of that in snakes. I know that the leafy lizard in Australia, which look kind of like blue-tongued skinks, they're really cool. They have lifelong partners, and I think are behaviorally and genetically monogamous too, which is really rare for any animal species. Like birds that people think of as mating for life, they're like cheating on each other all the time. But I don't think anybody has observed anything like that in the snake.
Okay. We have another question from the chat though, and it's, how do snakes avoid mating with their offspring or siblings?
Good question. I don't know that they do or that they can. So in general, reptiles are more resistant to negative implications of inbreeding. Like most animals have some sort of inbreeding avoidance, and that's because with a lot of different animals, you get genetic defects from babies that are closely related. So I don't know how much of that snakes have. I remember seeing a presentation on one of the adder species in Europe, and I think it was on an island. It was a really small population, and they were starting to see in the wild, because there were so few and everybody there was so highly inbred. So you probably did have snakes mating with offspring or siblings, because they were getting really weird things, like snakes born with like giant eyes, or like only one, and like not exactly in the right place. Some really like gnarly inbreeding effects there. But I don't know. We know that snakes can identify other individuals we think it's probably by their sense of smell. And so if they can do that, then maybe there is a way to detect by smell who is related to you. And then it's just when you're in that dire case of on an island with very, very few options that you go for it anyway.
Let's see.
I have a question myself. So I've heard stories about snakes that are able to either hold sperm for several years and then like reproduce seemingly on their own, or snakes that are actually capable of, and the word is slipping my mind right now, but reproducing on their own as a female, just laying eggs that are fertile.
Yeah, so the word I think you're looking for is parthenogenic,
yes,
or parthenogenesis.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. So that is really cool, and that snake can be parthenogenec. I think kind of plays into what we thought for a long time whenever a snake that had, usually was one that had been in captivity and had been by herself for a long time, suddenly laid viable eggs or had live babies, depending on what kind of snake it was. And people assumed they were storing, it was just long-term sperm storage. And it was not until the past maybe 10 years, maybe a little bit less than that we had the the tools and it became a lot cheaper to look, that they were able to see that that was not always what was happening, and that they were able to reproduce without males. And most of the time when that's happened, the babies have not been viable. Often they don't live very long, or they are sterile themselves, but that's not always the case, and it's not always an artifact of captivity. So with some species of snakes, their chromosomes, and I'm not going to remember the details, but like in humans, you have X chromosome, Y chromosome, that's male, and XX are females. And snakes have a different system. And apparently, like, offspring in some species as a result of parthenogenesis have a different chromosome. So that you can actually tell, without having to document that the animal was by themselves, you can see that this is happening in the wild. So they were actually able to see with some wild-born litters of snakes that the females would do this. And this probably has to do with in a lot of places, they just don't encounter themselves that often. So, I feel it. Like sometimes we'll walk around for days, it seems like, and not be able to find a rattlesnake, even though it's like, we know they live around here. We know this is good habitat, but you just don't encounter them. And so snakes have that problem sometimes too. And so parthenogenesis is probably giving females an opportunity to take advantage of, like, oh, conditions are really good. I ate really well last year. Like, I'm in good shape to have babies, but I didn't come across a male, so she can just go ahead and have her babies anyway. And that's probably why that developed, because of that. Sometimes you can't find a male. So yeah, it's cool. But they also, and their normal is for rattlesnakes and other vipers in the U.S., it's normal for them to store sperm for some amount of time. So a snake that gives birth this summer, so let's say they're going to give birth in July or August, which is when a lot of them do. Most of them bred with the males, the dad of that litter, a year ago, because their breeding season, when courtship and mating happens, is generally the same time of year. Some of them will have a second breeding season in the spring, but it's usually late summer or fall, and that's also when they're having babies, and they're collecting that sperm the year before. So it's normal for them to store it for almost a year. It depends on when they ovulate and then start their pregnancy or gravid for the egg layers. But yeah, some of them can do it for years aside from that, because again, they may not encounter another male, so might as well hold on to some of that sperm for future litters. But yeah, it's a really interesting adaptation to not living in these groups all the time, because even though, like with our Arizona Black, they are together in the spring, that's when they do their social behavior and they den over the winter. There's no courtship or mating that goes on in those social groups at the den, possibly because they're related. That may be the way that they avoid inbreeding, is that they den with their family and then they go off away from the den to find mates. We're not sure, but we know we don't see any of that courtship behavior at dens. And so yeah, once they split up, then it comes a lot harder to encounter your own kind.
We can kind of tie this topic into the question that was asked. If snakes don't have many adverse effects from inbreeding, how does that affect the process of evolution? And you can maybe include how self-reproduction affects that too.
Yeah, so I think that those, I'm guessing, and this is just a guess, that, even if there aren't those negative effects, that they probably can tell the difference, because we know that they can identify other individuals, and so their preference would probably be to not do that, because as far as I know, except in that one spot, you don't see abnormalities like that in wild snakes. So that, it just may be, it's a very rare thing. If there happens to be so few of them, then inbreeding is a last resort. And it sounds like parthenogenesis is a similar thing too, that it's, because yeah, you're not getting the kind of diversity that you'll get when you can breed with anyone else, and also with someone who's not related to you. So it could, and so I'm guessing if they have the opportunity to be with an actual male instead of just parthenogenesis, it seems like that they do. Like, it has been observed in the wild, but it's rare, both things. So I think that's why it's not been the most successful thing. Although it's interesting, like, there are entire lineages of lizards that's the only way they reproduce. The whiptail, there's several species of whiptails that the species formed of a hybrid origin from two different species, and now these species are all females, and they're basically just, they're only producing by parthenogenesis because there are no males. And that worked for them. Somehow that works for them.
Probably will continue to work for them until the environment changes.
Yeah.
Yes, that could very well be the case. It's a good point, Emma.
Yeah.
Not really sure how to say the word, but this is a question from me. When snakes or asexually reproduce, is it a genetic copy of the parent? Or I would assume so, but
I think so. I mean, like I said, some of them have that different chromosome, but I think the rest of it is pretty similar. I think, but they're not described as clones like you would with some others. But they're it's a very good question. My interest and research has been mostly in behavior, and that was such an ooh wow thing when it first started getting published a few years ago, that I sort of paid attention to it a little bit, but not digging into the details because I am not a geneticist. And it's not this particular species I work with. It's not something that they have been documented doing. But it's a good question.
I'm also curious if that chromosome you're talking about, the unique one, be like an inactive gene in the parent that emerges when they asexually reproduce.
Yeah, it could be. I cannot remember where or how, because it was so weird. It was like, how did they just have this whole another? Yeah, and it's still, I think, a pretty new and ongoing, like, trying to figure out how that all works. Because, like I said, for the longest time, it was just assumed that it must be super extra long-term sperm storage, and it wasn't until they were able to look at it in a different way, and then actually started looking at it in a different way, and started with getting zoos all over the country. It's like, have you had a female that's been by herself that's given birth? Like, send us tissue samples. Like, shed skins are a great cheap way to, like, get tissue samples. But they started realizing that there was more going on than just sperm storage.
Oh, we just got a really good question in the chat.
Yeah, that's a good question. Where is it? All right. Are there any situations where snakes were inbred to help repopulate an area or to help an endangered species, or did they go out and find mates that aren't related?
Yeah, so it was, that is a good question. It's only been pretty recently that we had the tools, and it was affordable enough to look at the genetics. So I know a lot of zoos with captive breeding programs, they have, like, stud books where they keep track of, who's who that way, because they've been in, like, those lines have been in captivity long enough to where they know for, like, I think every elephant in the zoo who's related to who, so they're very careful not to inbreed them in those programs. So there's a few rare snakes that have been held and bred in captivity for a while, but there's not many good examples of, I'm trying to think, like, if there have been any, like, repopulation. I know that they've tried that with some garter snakes here, and I don't think that they, like, tested everybody to make sure that they, like, weren't inbred, and I don't think that they weren't rare enough to where they would have been forced to do that. I think they just kind of let them do what they do and then just dump the babies in a pond somewhere, I think was how that it's not a, yeah, I wasn't very hearing that. I was just like, ugh, okay. Maybe not. So yeah, I'm trying to think, because I know San Francisco garter snakes have been, San Francisco garter snakes are a subspecies of common garter snake, which is a species that I imagine you'll have in Massachusetts as well, because they're pretty much everywhere in the U.S.
Yeah.
Except where I am. But San Francisco garter snake, that subspecies is beautiful. Everyone, if you've ever looked at pictures of snakes, you've probably seen a picture of them because they're like bright red, bright blue, bright black, sometimes with like some green on them and yellow. I mean, they're just gorgeous. And they're very rare because they only live on the San Francisco Peninsula. That is a heavily populated by human area, and they've probably always had a very small range. But that's now down to very few individuals in the wild. I think when I was working with the species, I'm wanting to say there were like 10 like well-known healthy populations. So not a lot. And they had them in zoos. They had some at the San Francisco Zoo, but I don't think they were releasing them to the wild, because I think they were trying to, because they didn't know the genetics. That was something that was just starting to get looked at 10 years ago when I was working with them. They were mainly trying to protect the ones that were still out in the wild, because although there have been a few examples of, success stories of captive breeding and then releasing animals into the wild, and that really helps to recover the species, it's very, very hard. It's very hard to do. It's very, very hard to do with animals that we know a lot about their biology, and their development. And I think peregrine falcons are probably the most famous example of one that was nearly extinct in the U.S. due to DDT, and then largely because of captive breeding and releasing those birds back into the wild. It was a success. Like, they're off the endangered species list now. Still not super common, but they did recover a great deal, and it was largely because of that. But it's California condors are a species that was bred in captivity, and they've been reintroducing them for a while, and that's been much tougher to do, partly because, well, mostly because the reason that the animals disappeared wasn't addressed. And that's often the situation, is that, when populations start dropping of some animal in the wild, there's a reason for that. Something happened, something changed. It's usually something that we did. And just breeding a bunch and letting them go, whether they're related or not related, isn't going to matter if that threat is still out there. So they're just, I can't think of examples of, and I know there are some really rare snakes on some islands in the Caribbean, but I don't know that they are trying to do captive breeding and head starting of those. But those are down to, I was just reading yesterday, one of them is like less than a couple dozen individuals in the wild.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's kind of getting to the point where they're already inbred, because that's not great. I mean, those are the kind of numbers that if it was a mammal, I don't want to say doomed, but really not good. Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I would like to think that if we do start doing that with snakes, since we have seen some inbred abnormalities pop up in some wild populations, that it's something that people pay better attention to than we necessarily have with some other animals before we knew as much about genetics as we do now.
Let's see. Oh, we got one more question. Well, there might be others, but how do snakes catch and eat their prey without hands or legs?
Yeah, a good one. I think for humans that are so dependent on, we use our hands for everything, and I think a lot of times we view snakes as just like they must be these helpless little worms because they've got no arms, they've got no legs, they can't run away. Like they're pretty. I mean, if you're not viewing them as like fierce predators that are out to get you, they might seem kind of helpless. So they have a lot of different ways. Again, there are many different kinds of snakes. They live in different places. They eat different things. So you have some snakes that rely on ambush hunting. And so ambush or sit and wait predation, this is rattlesnakes and a lot of the vipers, although it's not solely a viper trait and not all vipers hunt this way, but is very common among vipers. They'll use their excellent sense of smell to find a place that smells like a lot of their preferred food item uses that area. So along a rodent trail or a lizard trail, they'll find a place to sit where they are going to be hard to see. And they will sit there coiled up, waiting for something to run by so they can strike them and get them. And that may be minutes, might be hours, it might be weeks that they'll sit in the same spot. We had a rattlesnake that we tracked once he had this one favorite spot in a wash, and he would sit there for like a week, and then he'd go off like a quarter of a mile, go do some other things for a while, and then he would come right back to that same spot. You could almost trace the circle on the ground where he would be coiled and go right back to hunting in that spot again for like a few days or a week. But basically with these, especially the venomous sit and wait predators, so they sit in that spot, they wait for somebody to run by, and then they strike, and so that's biting. But I think most of us are probably familiar with the snakes like stretching their neck out, biting, and with a lot of these venomous species that are sit and wait hunters, they'll strike, they'll inject venom, and then they'll let go and let that animal wander off and die elsewhere. Because often, as animals, especially if it's a mammal, it's not pleasant to be injected with snake venom. It hurts. And so they're kicking and scratching and biting and doing all the things. And, predators can get hurt by their prey. It's not uncommon for like a lion to have his side tore open by a big water buffalo if they're tingling with something like that. So some of the venomous snakes, the way that they've gotten around this is by striking, injecting the venom, and then just letting them go and letting the prey go elsewhere. And then they again use that really good sense of smell to track where the animal that they injected went. And studies in the labs have shown that snakes can smell the difference between a trail left by a mouse and a trail left by a mouse that they injected venom into. It smells different, and they'll follow the one that they injected instead of just like whatever mouse trail. So then they find it. Hopefully, they don't always find it. And then they swallow them whole for the most part. I did see, I don't remember the name of the snake, but it was on a BBC documentary, a snake that ate these, they lived in mangrove swamps, I think, and they ate these crabs, and they would actually, and it was amazing to watch them do this, again, with no arms or legs, tear the legs off of the crab because they just wanted the middle part. And they would like rub it against, I mean, it also looked really cruel, but it was just really interesting because it just had no idea that snakes were capable of that. So that's one way they hunt, and that's a lot of them do that. Will sit and wait for something to come their way. But there are snakes, like I've watched gopher snakes and whip snakes, and coach whips and racers are more of your active foragers. So they're out looking for other animals, and so they're crawling around in the shrubbery or across the desert and looking for other animals they can catch. And I've seen them, do this and come up next to, or even do a combination of going out and crawling and sitting and waiting. There was one in our garden 2 summers ago, and it was a whip snake, and he had been crawling around the yard, and he finally settled on this area where there were a couple rocks that we placed in this spot for lizards to bask on. And I guess they smelled like lizards basked on them a lot. And so the whip snake kind of settled down, but he only settled down, and he wasn't in a little like hunting coil like you'd expect a viper to be in. He just sort of stayed still, and sure enough, a lizard came out on the rock close enough to him, and he got him. I've also seen, and this is another one of those like, wow, just never would have thought that you could do this without arms or legs. I have trouble digging when I have tools in addition to arms and legs. I've seen patch-nosed snakes on more than one occasion digging. So sometimes they'll just stick their little face into a burrow. And we have a video of a patch-nosed snake digging on our YouTube channel. They've got this at large scale on their rostrum, so kind of like the end of their nose. And it probably helps them dig. It's harder, it's thick, it acts like a little scoop, and they'll stick their head down in a hole and then kind of twist their head at the neck one way or another, and then like scoop dirt back out. And I've seen them do that digging thing to dig up lizards and small mammals out of holes. And so they'll just do that until they get close enough where they can grab them with their mouth and pull them out and constrict them, or sometimes they just sort of like mash them to death as they're eating them. And then I think a lot of people are probably familiar with the idea of snakes constricting. So boa constrictor is probably the most famous for that, although that's just one species of boa. All boas are constrictors, pythons. There's a lot of other snakes that kill by constriction too, and constriction is just basically hugging their food to death, which is something you don't need arms for. So they just wrap their bodies around and squeeze until it depends on the species and the difference in body size and strength between the snake and whatever they're squeezing. But the main idea is just until they can't breathe anymore, which could be minutes, could be hours. I feel like with a large, like an anaconda going after another large reptile like a caiman, I'm thinking that they sometimes have to do that for more than a day because caimans can hold their breath for a very long time.
Interesting. Have you ever heard of an instance where a snake kind of held a territory, or maybe was territorial? Like outside of just staying within a certain area, do they try to drive other snakes away from their spot, or do they have a tendency just to live together relatively easily?
Yeah, this is a good question. So as recently as maybe 2 years ago, I would have said that across the board, snakes are very tolerant of other snakes. They are not territorial. They're fine with sharing space. Males will fight over access to females because, again, sometimes those are hard to come by, so you're willing to fight for it. But I have since then read, and I'm not going to remember the name of the species, but it was a snake that specialized on, I think it's sea turtle eggs. And when, especially the females of the species, when they find like a sea turtle nest, and, you know, a lot of times sea turtles lay hundreds of eggs. So if they find one sea turtle nest, like that snake, they're good for the whole year. Like that's enough food for them. If they find it, you know, early enough before the babies hatch. And they'll actually guard their nest, their sea turtle nest, because sea turtles don't, I think, ever guard their babies or their nest, I mean. So yeah, they'll guard those nests from other snakes. So there's probably more examples out there. It's just, I mean, it's one of the things that, you know, we were talking about the most interesting species of snake, and I said that one of, you know, for some of these things with Arizona black rattlesnakes, why I think it's interesting is because we don't know. And I think that for me is one of the things I find so interesting about snakes in general is there's so much that we don't know about them. And they're different. And while we do have a lot of things in common with them, there's also a lot about them that's very different from us. So yeah, it makes it very interesting for me.
I think the species you're talking about is the striped kukri snake.
That sounds familiar. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a really pretty snake, actually. It has like bright orange and yellow markings, and then like a blackish. Yeah. Okay. Let's see what else we have. What is the world's smallest species of snake?
The world's smallest species of snake is a thread snake. So a thread snake was the one that I mentioned earlier that some species of thread snakes can have symbiotic relationships with screech owls, where they're little like nest cleaner uppers. But the rarest species of thread snake, which I guess just recently changed from another species of thread snake. Thread snakes are super, super small. I'm sorry. You asked about rarest, not smallest, right?
Oh no, I said smallest.
Okay, you did say smallest. Yeah. Okay, sorry. I'm confusing myself because I'm reading the chat and I shouldn't be doing that while I'm trying to answer the question. So thread snakes are these really tiny snakes that eat invertebrates, like the ones that live with screech owls. And apparently there's one whose range is, they're a pretty recently discovered snake. They only live, I think, on 1 or 2 islands. And they're the ones that I mentioned earlier that are no bigger around than a piece of spaghetti. And I think they top out at 4 inches as adults.
Wow.
Yeah, so small. I mean, the kind of snakes that I joke around that the thread snakes that we have in the Southwest look like night crawlers. I mean, these are so small they would look like some kind of parasite, like not even like an earthworm. They're so tiny. Can't imagine.
Are they blind snakes? I'm just looking at a picture of one that looks like it. But...
Yeah. So I'm not common names. Unlike birds, there isn't a national or an international like official list of common names. So I think the ones here that are now called thread snakes used to be called blind snakes. So they're the same. They look very, I mean, they're even kind of a pinkish color. Most of them or all of them, like earthworms, and their eyes are just like these tiny little black dots. They're real simple. They probably don't see very well. They live underground, all of them. But yeah, thread snakes, blind snakes, I think those are kind of interchangeable, or depends on the species which one that they're called.
All right, well, why don't we take a quick 5-minute break? So if people need to get water or whatever, I'll continue sitting here and drawing. And yeah, thanks for tuning in so far, guys. We're just going to be taking a quick break. I think Melissa could use a glass of water. Talking that long does get a little bit tiring. I speak from experience there.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So Miles, I started doing pixel art. Like I tried to draw a snake normally using line art, but then because I'm using the same laptop to host the stream, to host the Zoom call, and to draw on, everything is just laggy. So I was like, screw this, I'm doing pixel art.
Yeah, it looks like your stylus is like skipping almost.
Yeah, it's really just skipping at this point, so I just started doing pixel art. It's honestly...
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this one actually is coming together very nicely.
I want that once you're done with it, by the way. I want a picture of that.
I mean, I might
kind of blends two things I like, so...
Yeah, I mean, I add flowers to anything, you'll like it, but...
I mean, yeah, for the most part.
Yeah, I might ask Melissa if they can put this up in the ASB store, because a lot of my designs are up there as stickers or t-shirts or whatever.
That'll make a really good sticker, yeah.
Yeah, it'd be really pretty.
Yeah, this is lovely. I'm sure we can, when I have a minute to do that, put it up.
Yeah.
Yes, I am just amazed. I mean, as much as I can watch this while trying to pay attention to what I'm saying, like, you just do this. This is like live on the screen. You're just putting this together, and it's so beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a little bit hard to get commissions through YouTube, because I think they removed their donation feature through the top chat, which made things a little bit complicated.
Oh yeah, there isn't actually an option.
Yeah.
I didn't notice that.
There used to be one, I think, a while ago, and people would send me something and I'd draw something for them, but I guess not today.
Why they
it's
remove
okay, though.
that?
I don't know. It might be related to the fact that I got demonetized earlier.
Okay.
Yeah, because apparently YouTube's algorithm did not like that I was putting together like big animation projects because they thought I was re-uploading other people's videos, which I was,
Okay.
but they gave me permission to use it and YouTube can't tell, so they were like, hey, copyright strike, you're demonetized, and I was like, thanks. Thanks so much, YouTube. Love you.
That's pretty lame.
Yeah.
One thing I noticed that they changed recently that I just can't stand is that they changed how you swap resolution.
Oh yeah, you
Because apparently people couldn't figure out what different resolutions meant.
Oh,
so now there's like an advanced setting, which is kind of annoying, but
yeah.
that's not a big deal. But that's just aggravating.
The product design here is kind of
yeah.
YouTube, please step your game up.
Yeah, upgrades are or updates are supposed to be upgrades, but that one was definitely not.
Yeah, it's not always the case. If only.
If only. Actually, while we're here, if the chat wants to request the next snake species that I'm drawing, feel free to go ahead. I'm currently doing, I think it's a timber rattlesnake, using a color scheme that I made earlier. So it's not totally accurate. It's a little bit pink washed to make it blend better with the roses, but if you guys want to see like a Taiwanese rat snake or maybe a sea snake of some sort or whatever, please do let me know and I will probably start pixel arting that next.
Very cool.
Unfortunately, I cannot do very much more than pixel art.
When should we start back up with questions?
I actually will take a quick break now that you guys are back. I'm gonna be right back.
All right. Sure. Saying. My computer sounds like it's about to take off. I'm just going to check on that.
Okay, I am back. I have had water that tastes kind of sketchily like metal, but it's okay. All right, we're back. We're back to answering questions and drawing snakes. So, yeah.
Well, since we left off on what was the smallest species, what's the largest?
Ooh. So this is actually like, strangely maybe, a bit of a controversy. So with most animals, when we talk about size and how big something is, we generally think about mass. Like, there's no debate that the largest terrestrial mammal is an elephant, even though a giraffe with their long neck are taller or longer than an elephant. But with snakes, we tend to focus on length. And although, it might be, you might assume that like, well, the longest one's probably also the heaviest, but it's not. So there are two contenders for who's the biggest snake. And one is reticulated pythons. They live in Southeast Asia. And they are probably without question the longest. They can get up to 30 feet, I think, is around the record size for reticulated python, which is very long. But compared to green anacondas, which are a type of boa, so closely related, but a different family. Boas are live-bearing, pythons lay eggs. Green anacondas live in South America, and female green anacondas, because there's a huge difference in size between male and female green anacondas. Female green anacondas are much bigger, And they can get to be almost as long as a reticulated python, but where they really win out on big is heavy. They're a lot heavier bodied than reticulated pythons. And I'm not sure what the most a reticulated python has weighed, but green anacondas can get to be, female green anacondas can get to be 300 pounds. So they are giant. So judging by the way that we judge other animals, green anacondas are the winner. But a lot of people think reticulated pythons because they're longer.
Let's see. What's the difference between poison and venom, and are there poisonous snakes?
This is a good question. So I know that a lot of snake enthusiasts and snake biologists get really irritable when people talk about poisonous snakes and are very quick to point out that snakes aren't poisonous, they're venomous. So the difference between venomous and poisonous is poison means if I eat it, it will make me sick or it will kill me. Venomous means that if it not necessarily eats me, but it bites me, it injects me, it stings me, that's venom. So venom is something that is injected into you by teeth or a stinger in the case of some other animals that aren't snakes. So that's venom. So most of the snakes that people think of as dangerous or deadly or poisonous are actually venomous. You can totally eat a rattlesnake. People do. I wouldn't recommend it. I've heard that they don't taste very good also, just why. But it's not going to kill you unless you're eating the venom gland and you have a cut in your mouth or something. But they have more recently discovered that there are at least some snakes that can be poisonous, that actually have chemicals in their bodies that if you eat them, it will make you sick. So there's a snake in Australia that feeds on, specializes on a toad that is a poisonous toad. And when the snake eats enough of those toads, they sequester. So they take on that poison into their own tissues. And so then the snake becomes poisonous too. Even though they don't produce it on their own, they can get it from the toads that they eat. And so then they become a poisonous snake. And I think there is some information that some garter snakes in the western U.S. that eat newts, and newts also have poisonous secretions on their skin, like pretty poisonous. Apparently, if you eat a newt, it could kill you. I don't know why anybody would want to do that. And yeah, so there's some information that some of the garter snakes that eat a lot of newts could be doing the same thing, sequestering poison from the newts to be becoming poisonous themselves, even though they normally aren't.
I know we have a comment in the chat, and it's just a way to remember poison versus venom. And it's if you bite it and you die, it's poisonous. If it bites you and you die, it's venomous.
Yep. Yes. Yeah. I was trying to remember that very short way of putting it. Yeah, that's it.
I think I remember reading about this nudibranch recently called a blue dragon that actually eats manivores and sequesters the poison, which I thought was really interesting. What is that?
The blue glaucus? I think I'm saying that wrong, but it's that funky nudibranch. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like very frilly and kind of spiky looking.
It eats manivores, I believe, or feeds on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. The sequestering of poison from other animals and maybe plants too. Yeah, it's something that I think there's several examples of very different types of animals that can do that, which is cool.
It's also kind of like a random story, but one experience I have with a poisonous animal is my dad almost kind of caught and held a cane toad in Jamaica, which was kind of interesting. And 7-year-old me comes running out of the house screaming not to touch it because he didn't know better. So kind of like a strange swapping of roles there, but
yeah.
Let's see. Someone asked, how many kinds of snakes consume poisonous animals?
Oh boy. Yeah. So like we said, poisonous means if I bite it, I die. And I just said that there are garter snakes that can eat those newts that are poisonous. I am not sure of the number. That is an example I'm familiar with because I worked with some of those garter snakes in places where they ate newts, and I'm guessing either that they have developed a resistance to that poison, or it could just be that that poison only affects mammals because maybe that would normally be the main predator for newts and not so much snakes. Maybe that came about later when all the mammals couldn't eat them anymore. I'm not actually sure. I'm sure there are other examples. I mean, the snake in Australia that sequesters poisons from the toad is one that is apparently immune to that poisonous toad. And, most toads in the U.S. are poisonous to a degree. I mean, some of them are just kind of like, doesn't feel good. Some of them will have like psychedelic properties if done correctly. Otherwise, makes you really, really sick. And it's an issue with one of our larger species of toads in southern Arizona, is that a lot of dogs, because they get close to them or bite them and then end up getting squirted in the mouth and the face with their nasty and poisonous secretions, like, can die from those toads. But snakes eat them just fine. So I'm not sure if that means that they have developed resistance, like happens a lot in nature, kind of the arms race between potential prey trying to figure out ways to avoid predators. And one of the ways is like making yourself distasteful or poisonous. And then predators developing immunity to those things and other tactics to get around it. But it could also just be that those poisons aren't, they're specialized for other types of animals and not snakes. I'm not sure, but there are a lot of snakes that eat toads in the U.S., and I'm guessing there are a lot in other places in the world too. And it's very common for toads to be poisonous. And I think there are snakes that eat poison dart frogs as well, which also are very poisonous. So it's a good question. I'm guessing it's really common, but I don't know the exact number of them.
Okay. Let's see. To keep going with venom, and what can venom be used for outside of catching prey, and how do people use it?
Good question. So for snakes, they pretty much just use their venom to subdue their prey. Sometimes, depending on the snake, there's a lot of snakes that we call non-venomous or harmless that actually do have some venom, but it's just that the venom is not the type that hurts people. So we call them non-venomous, but they're totally venomous. So hognose snakes are one example of that. That's found all across the southern U.S. and they are venomous. And actually, depending on the size of the hognose and how much venom it wants to give you, it can be quite unpleasant to get bit by a hognose. They just rarely bite, except my captive hognose, who bites anytime she gets the chance. Unhappy caged snake.
Hognoses are like little jesters. I love them.
We were real excited when someone gave it to us because they do a lot of other cool things that I will come back to if there's not another question. But to get back to this, so there's so the venom is a lot of times just there to kind of stun the prey. So if they're not one of those snakes that strikes and lets the animal like walk away and die elsewhere, like maybe they just want to calm them down so that they're not fighting as much to decrease their chance of getting injured by their prey. The venom is useful for that. But venom actually evolved from being a digestive enzyme. So it is still a powerful digestive enzyme. And a lot of the human, so think about the nastiest pictures you've seen of somebody getting bit by a snake, and you can picture arms turning black and yellow and fingers and toes falling off. And the reason that venom does that is because it's digesting you. Not all venoms work like that. Some of them are more geared towards attacking the and nervous system. Those are the ones that kill their prey or someone else that's messing with them faster, the ones that attack the nervous system. But at its heart, it was probably originally a digestive enzyme that later evolved to also help subdue and kill food. So snakes, if threatened, will bite. It's not their primary defense for most of them. It's about, just trying to not be seen to avoid the whole confrontation with the threat in the first place. Or they'll try to flee. Some of them do things like rattling. Hognose do their adorable thing of flipping on their back and playing dead and showing off their bright bellies to make it seem like they're, probably taste bad or are poisonous, which, as far as I know, they're not, but they eat toads, so maybe they are. I don't know that anybody's looked at that. But they will also bite, and so in that case, the venom is used as a defense for like that, when a human is handling or trying to kill a snake and they get bit. So outside of what snakes use it for, humans have done a fair amount of research with venom, and the number one thing that we use venom for probably is producing anti-venom. So the exact steps of the process I'm not super familiar with because it's not my area of study, but basically we take venom and introduce small amounts of it in other animals so that they can develop antibodies, and then we use that process to produce anti-venoms, and that saves lives for people that get bit by truly deadly venomous snakes. And you have to have venom to produce anti-venom. Thank you, Miles, for finding a video of a hognose playing dead.
Oh yeah, of course.
They're so cool.
Right at the end.
Yeah.
Actually.
So it's important to produce anti-venom. They've also used venom in research for things like blood thinners and painkillers because they think that part of the mechanism for subduing their prey is kind of not putting them to sleep, but just kind of like you would anesthetize somebody for a surgery. And so they've looked at venom to see if there are any properties that we can use to make safer anesthetics and painkillers for humans. There's also a component of snake venom that was used in breast cancer research and Alzheimer's. And I don't think those have finished products yet, but last I heard, that was some promising work. And, again, like there's probably still a ton of venoms that we haven't started investigating their potential uses of yet.
Right at the end of that link that I sent, if no one wants to watch the entire video, it's kind of funny. The person handling the snake will flip them on their stomach and they'll invert themselves again over and over again.
Yep.
Right after you're dead.
Yeah, I'm not sure why they think that adds to it because it's like, you're pretty much alive. But yeah,
look how dead I am.
Hognose. Yeah, the first hognose I found in the wild, like all I wanted was a photo of just them being normal, and yeah, she just kept flipping over on her back with the mouth open and the tongue hanging out. They get really determined to do that. My captive one though, all she does is bite. She has never played dead. Not interested in that.
One more question relating to venom. What happens when a venomous snake bites itself?
Ooh, good one. Yeah, so it seems like they would be totally immune to their own venom, and they certainly seem to be more resistant to it than their prey is, but not completely immune. So, and this is based off observations, either my own or from talking to other researchers who have seen this happen. So I've seen rattlesnakes bite themselves during fighting with other rattlesnakes when the two males are in combat over a female. I've never seen them bite each other, and it's not part of that routine, but I have seen them accidentally bite themselves. And also, when we handle venomous snakes, a lot of times we use these clear plastic tubes, which basically looks like a straw that's slightly less big around than the fattest part of the snake, and you insert their head into one end, so you can keep an eye on them and what they're doing, but it means that they can't bite you because you don't let them crawl all the way through to the other side. That's why you pick one that's slightly less big around than the fattest part of the snake. And depending on the size of it and how stressed out the snake, how stressed out you let the snake get while he's in that tube, how long you're handling him. I've seen snakes open their mouth in that tube, and then with rattlesnakes, because their fangs, which is what they use to inject their venom, are so long, they have to fold them up in order to get them back into their mouth. They're not just hanging down like our teeth are all the time. And so sometimes they'll open their mouth in the tube, and because it's such a small place, they can't close it back up properly. So the fangs will get closed on the outside of their mouth, and they'll end up, because they're recurved, the fangs, like a cat's claw, they'll end up injecting themselves in their chin. And even though that's like right there at their head, which you think would be, I mean, like I would not want to get bit in my face, but the snake seems like a bad place to get it. Their chin just kind of swells up a little bit, and that's it. So it doesn't seem like a big deal. So that said, there's a story of someone who was catching a snake, and they have these like grabber things to catch this rattlesnake. And this snake was just terrified. She was freaking out and just kind of like writhing and just like striking at whatever, and whatever ended up being herself. And she bit herself apparently right in the heart. And the researchers who this happened to said, because she died like pretty quickly, just kind of went into convulsions or whatever and died. It looked like her heart exploded from her own venom. So they can kill themselves by biting themselves. And I would assume that would also happen if they bit another of the same species, but it has to be like right into or right at the heart. It seems like other places it probably feels terrible, but not deadly.
Let's see. Well, we have another question that's kind of not really pertaining to venom, but more so why ASP was established, rattlesnake roundups. And I personally don't believe this question is right, but I'll still ask it. Don't we need events like rattlesnake roundups and snake rodeos to control snake populations?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. The most recent place that I read this myth, and I'll just go ahead and call it a myth, that we need roundups to control snake populations. It was stated as fact in this article. It was like all wildlife, we have to be able, they need to be controlled by us hunting or picking them off in some form. And I think to all of us who think about nature, who know anything about it, who studied it, or even just have been out there or read books or watched a documentary, knows that not every ecosystem needs humans to kill other animals for things to be kept in check. They have lots of predators and disease and varying levels of their food. As prey populations increase and decrease, there's more or less to it. All of those things keep populations of wildlife in check. When we think about things becoming overpopulated or, not in check anymore, that's usually because of something we've done. And the classic example of that is in some parts of the United States, where there are no large predators. There are no more wolves because we killed them all off. There are very few or maybe no mountain lions. And so there's not a lot of large predators of deer. And so you do end up having too many deer. But that's not the case with rattlesnakes anywhere. And they have so many predators: hawks, eagles, owls, fox, badgers. I think we already went through some of this list. Other snakes, humans are a tiny part of that. They still have healthy populations of all those other predators. Disease is still a thing they have to deal with, and varying levels of food that's available to them each year. All of those things keep their population in check. Roundups are definitely not needed for that purpose. And the other example I like to point to is that in Arizona and Southern California and, well, Massachusetts isn't a great example because your rattlesnakes there are way threatened and endangered for other reasons.
They're gone, yeah.
Yeah, they're gone pretty much. Which isn't funny. It's very sad, but yeah, there's so few. There's like 4 populations in the whole state, unfortunately. But yeah, like in Southern California and Arizona has more species of rattlesnakes than any other state in the country, and more individual rattlesnakes because there's still a lot of open space in Arizona. And they haven't had a rattlesnake roundup in Arizona for more than 50 years. And it was not something that, I think that was like kind of a one-time thing. It's not an established practice. There isn't a regular hunt or call of rattlesnakes in Arizona. And despite that, they have not taken over the state. So there's really no need for those things in other places either.
I have a question. So some snakes that mainly feed on the vertebrates, will they resort to eating insects if populations are low? Yeah.
I think that's probably true. I'm guessing that the anecdote I shared earlier about the racers that during a particular time of year would shift to grasshoppers, or we think it was a shift. In other places, I don't think racers, especially adults, eat a ton of invertebrates. I think that they're more mammal and lizard eaters. We don't have racers where I live. We have whip snakes and coach whips, which are really closely related. And they mostly eat lizards and other snakes. But yeah, I think at that site, there was a couple things going on. One is that the racers were ridiculously small compared to most racers. There were some lizards, but not a lot. So I think just because of their size and the food availability, when there was just an explosion of blackberries, there's probably also an explosion of insects to eat them. And so they're probably just taking advantage of that being everywhere. And I'm guessing that that's not the only snake that will do that.
I'm starting to run out. Let's see.
Oh, I realized just now that I think I have Super Chat disabled, so we aren't able to collect any donations through the chat. But that's okay, because I've directed people towards the snakes.ngo website. So if you would like to donate to help fund research and advocations for snakes and their preservation, please head to I can speak, I swear. www.snakes.ngo.
Oh yeah, I'm kind of curious. What species of snakes have you studied? I know about the Arizona rattlesnakes, but what else, if any?
Yeah, yes, there have been others. So the first study I was involved with on snakes was working at a golf course outside of Tucson, Arizona. That was actually where Jeff, the other half of Advocates for Snake Preservation, and I met. This was a fairly new golf course and housing development, and the purpose of the study was to see what the effect of a new development like that in some pretty raw, untouched desert would do to the reptile and amphibian population. So we were really studying all of the reptiles and amphibians that lived there, but because the scientist in charge of the project was a rattlesnake nut, it definitely revolved around rattlesnakes and tiger rattlesnakes, western diamondback rattlesnakes, and western black-tailed rattlesnakes were the 3 species that lived at that site. Tiger rattlesnakes were his thing, so we did a lot of radio telemetry, which is like, I think most people are familiar with putting collars on mammals and following them around to learn about the size of their home range and what they eat and their behavior. So you can't collar a snake. So radio telemetry is most often done by implanting a radio inside their body cavity. So you do it with surgery. There are some other ways that people have tried with some success, but the surgical method is what we use. And so those were the most intense study we did there was radiotelemetry with tiger rattlesnakes. But we also did surveys, especially around the golf course, because it was fun and it was easy to find snakes there because it was a pretty naturalistic golf course. I think for me, when I first moved out here from the eastern U.S., I was used to golf courses just looking like a big green lawn. But a lot of desert style golf courses aren't like that. They basically put like the greens and then where the holes are, they leave the natural vegetation intact in between. But also because of having to irrigate the grass, it's like you've got all the precipitation of, I don't know, like the eastern U.S. in a desert where we normally survive, the animals and plants here, on so little water that you add water and it just turns into this oasis. And so this golf course is just full of every kind of animal that was native there. And we saw mountain lions and bobcats fairly often, and I've seen them almost never since then anywhere else, but they were all over the golf course. Tons of birds, tons of small mammals, tons of snakes, tons of lizards. So we also gopher snakes and coach whips and whip snakes are pretty common there that we studied. The focus was really on tiger rattlesnakes. And then also studied the effects of fire on rock rattlesnakes in southeastern Arizona in a national park. And I already talked about most of the Arizona black rattlesnake stuff before. My partner Jeff and I worked at a site in coastal California, just between Santa Cruz and San Francisco, looking at, this was also an effect of fire study. And again, we were looking at the larger snake community, but our main focus of that study was San Francisco garter snakes because they are a federally threatened species and I think a state endangered species in California because they are so rare. So we were focusing on those, but they were, even though that was one of the healthy populations of those snakes, they were still pretty rare. So we ended up taking a lot of data on those racers because there were so many. I think by the end of the 5 years that different groups of people were working out there, we had marked over 400 individual racers in a not very big area. It was amazing. There are also gopher snakes there. Who else did we have common? Oh, rubber boas, which was really cool because I had never seen one before. And they are just as adorable and fun as they always seem like they would be in pictures. So boas, I always associated them with like the jungle and being this very exotic snake. But we have 3 species of boas, because I think now rubber boas are actually 2 different species. But we have several native species of boa in the U.S., the ones that are supposed to be here, not like the ones in Florida that people have introduced. So there's rubber boas, or northern and southern rubber boas, and then also rosy boas, which live in southeastern California and I guess just western Arizona. Have not studied rosies. And then studies since then, besides the Arizona blacks, we worked at a nature preserve where we were, in general, just kind of doing an inventory and tracking just sort of like the diversity, what species occurred there, how often we saw them. Occasionally started doing some, more interesting like natural history and behavior notes at this preserve. And that was where we saw the patch nose snakes I mentioned earlier digging. It was really cool. There were lots of western diamondback rattlesnakes there, Arizona black rattlesnakes and black-tailed rattlesnakes, and also a lot of Sonoran whip snakes, not as many coach whips, common king snakes, a few of them, but there has been a lot of rattlesnakes. They're easier, for someone who's interested in behavior like I am, rattlesnakes are a little bit easier because unlike, and I think this has less to do with them, they're still scared of us, but their reaction to being scared is to more often sit still than some of the non-venomous species. So often, and I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this with snakes that you encounter, like garter snakes and stuff, they just flee. So it's really hard to get to see them do anything. and the social nature of rattlesnakes with their nesting behavior and their overwintering being at these den sites that they'll use year after year means that we can set up cameras and we can monitor behavior that way. And we just haven't found as many places and as many opportunities to do that with non-venomous snakes, although we've now gotten some better cameras, and so we're able to get some denning behavior of striped whip snakes too, which use they share dens with Arizona black rattlesnakes.
I have another question too, and it's kind of more like a preservation question. I know that up here, a lot of contract work is done when companies want to expand into areas by naturalists, and they make sure that endangered or threatened species won't be like severely impacted. Does that happen in the southern U.S.? And especially, does it happen a lot for snakes?
Yeah, so it's a mixed bag. So pretty much all of the research on San Francisco garter snakes, because they're rare, they're beautiful, they're harmless, they've been on the endangered species list for a very long time. Like I think since before it was actually called the Endangered Species Act, the precursor to that. I think they've been listed since 1969, so a long time. Pretty much all of the research that is done on them sort of results from the very type of projects that you've mentioned. Someone's trying to do some sort of new development, and they need to make sure there are no garter snakes there, or see if they know that they are on site, that what they're proposing to do isn't going to have a huge negative impact. Mm-hmm. And that's the way that most research happens on that species. And people do change what they do based on them. So where that falls apart a lot of the times for snakes, and this was kind of what led us to form this organization, is, I said we worked at the golf course, so we were looking at the effects of the golf course on snakes. And when we were doing radio telemetry, we were doing that on rattlesnakes. And when I was in a national park studying the effects of fire, I was also on a rattlesnake, rock rattlesnake. And the idea would be that whatever our findings were, that would not just direct, but at least inform how those places would be managed and how things would be done there and in other places in the future. And what we ran into informally at a lot of the places we worked is that when people found out, people are always interested in science, and you're like waving an antenna in an air, like clearly tracking an animal or using other like sciencey looking equipment, people get real excited and interested about that. But when you tell them it's snakes, especially a venomous snake, that changes pretty quickly to, at best, apathy. Like they don't care. Why would anybody care about that? And we had a lot of people just flat out say, well, wouldn't it be better if the fire just burned up all the rattlesnakes and chased them out of the park? Because why would we want a dangerous animal like that on the park or near the golf course or near houses or whatever? And that was, I was kind of shocking to us because we love the animals, and it was just like, but this is their home. But that's not the way a lot of people think. People, again, because of them being portrayed so negatively, and the relative risk and threat that they pose to us has just been so crazy magnified in media, that people are scared of them, and they think that this is a safety issue. Like the way I've often heard it said is like, well, you wouldn't just leave a loaded gun like in the school play yard, which is just it's not the same thing at all. So that was a lot of why we formed this organization, was to change that, because we met with it in a one-on-one of people seeming not to care, but these weren't people that had decision-making abilities. But in other places, that is what happened, and projects have been shut down. So several years ago, we were involved with an issue in Massachusetts where the Fish and Wildlife, I forget exactly the name of the division, but the state chapter that's in charge of fish and wildlife in Massachusetts and conservation, they had decided to introduce a population of timber rattlesnakes into an island in the Quabbin Reservoir. And because that's a reservoir, that island was off limits to the public. You're not supposed to boat. You weren't supposed to boat out there, walk around on the island. So the conservation managers really thought that this was the perfect situation. It's like, well, we'll put the rattlesnakes out here on an island. We'll have another spot. We can have population number 5 in the state. Like, they're really hurting in Massachusetts. And so, and it's an island. Like, so people don't need to worry about it. We're not throwing down snakes in people's backyards. And that is not how the public perceived it at all. The story got twisted around, and there was a ton of pushback. The media and it also turned into this political game where the party that was in charge was, versus the party that wasn't in charge, like, kind of decided like this was their issue to fight back on. And it got turned into like, well, they're putting rattlesnakes with little parachutes and like dropping them into people's backyards. There are these stories about, eagles would grab them off the island and drop them into your playpen or something. I mean, it was kind of ridiculous. So what we did is we came in and we did a big public relations and media campaign where we reached out to as many newspapers and TV stations and radio stations as possible to let them know, like, here are the facts about the project. Like, here's what they're actually proposing to do. This is why it's safe. This is why it's needed, because they are so rare. And here's the kind of behavior you can actually expect from rattlesnakes, including talking to people that lived who had timber rattlesnakes in their actual backyard, like lived next to, I guess one of the populations of timber rattlesnakes there is really close. I mean, I guess in Massachusetts, you can't get really far away from some sort of housing development.
From anything,
but yeah.
pretty much. It's a pretty small state.
Yeah, exactly. So there are some that live close to people already, and those people that live there, they don't have an issue. They regularly hike in the woods, and when they do come near one, it's not a big deal. I can't remember when the last recorded fatality or even like a bad bite. It was so far in the past, but yeah, that was a project that was almost shut down and had some much wider negative implications for wildlife conservation in general in Massachusetts if it had gone through. That we were able to stop, because that is something that has happened, especially for rattlesnake projects in this country in the past, is that when people find out you're doing something to encourage something that they see as dangerous, and the biologists and managers haven't done a good job of communicating how and why this is safe, then those projects get shut down, even if they are, much needed. It's hard for people to see past everything that's been said to them their whole life about how awful these animals are.
Oh, we have another question. And it's about urbanization. And would it be possible for snakes to adapt to urbanization, like pigeons, rats, and gulls, and also peregrine falcons, to add that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a good question. And thanks for bringing up the peregrine falcon example, because that's primarily where they live now, outside of some places in the West where they still have a lot of the cliff habitat that they used to use, as they've adapted really well to nesting on skyscrapers and eating those pigeons and other birds that inhabit the city. So I think it's a little tougher for some snakes because of the persecution aspect. Even though people don't like pigeons, I think pigeons reproduce much more often and faster and more babies and stuff than snakes, which probably helps them. Also, they're still birds, even though as far as birds go, pigeons aren't the most popular or anything close to that. They're generally not hated as much as snakes. So I think that makes it a little bit harder for a snake to be totally adapted and thriving in an urban area because of that. Also, a big issue for them whenever they lived near enough to roads is road mortality. So, something comes close to a rat or a bird or peregrine, their reaction, a moving thing, if they have enough time to see it, is they're going to try to get away. But for snakes, as I alluded to earlier, oftentimes their reaction to anything they feel is threatening or scary is to just stop and stay still. And that really doesn't work for them when there are cars around. So that alone is probably a bigger reason why they have a harder time in an urban area are cars. Because anytime they try to cross the road, if it has any traffic at all, they often don't make it. We don't know how big a factor road mortality is. It's a difficult thing to quantify because, you know, we have a lot of scavengers in the U.S. scavenging animals that pick those carcasses off before people can even, you know, count them. But I imagine it takes a huge toll in some areas on some snakes. And so that makes it really hard. I think it's more common in other parts of the world to have more snakes living in cities, both because people are a little more tolerant and there are, and I haven't seen this written anywhere, but as I'm like talking out and thinking about it, there's less road traffic that people are still moving about in cities more on foot and on bicycles, where they actually have a chance to see and avoid a snake instead of just running over them like people usually do in cars. That said, in the outskirts of cities, so like suburban areas, garter snakes can do very well. That's pretty common, backyard snake, wherever they occur. So not in a city where you've got a lot of concrete, but in places where there's still like some vegetation and ponds and places for them to hide, things for them to eat. And then in the Southwest, often Western diamondback rattlesnakes can do okay, it seems like, in the outskirts around town, but certainly suffer some due to persecution and getting run over by cars still.
I'm assuming urban sprawl might be an issue with that too, if they can only survive in suburbs and outskirts.
Yeah. I think that's it. I think once they start, again, when there are a lot of roads between them and, you know, the female snake that they need to get to breed with, or between where they eat and spend the summer and where they spend the winter, when they have to start crossing roads, then that makes it, you know, where they can't do it anymore because it's getting run over.
Let's see. I have one little side note. You were talking about kind of how animals are portrayed differently and also how governments don't really want to help them. I know that with mushrooms, like any mushroom in the US, there's no federal legislation over them or state protection because they're viewed as lesser organisms. So I think that's a little related, and I'm not a big fan of that personally because there's plenty of plants that are endangered and under strict protection, but doesn't extend to mushrooms.
Wow. Yeah, I guess because I wonder if you even can list a mushroom because they're not a plant. And I'm guessing that the way that the Endangered Species Act is written, it probably excludes anything that's not in the animal and plant kingdom. That's really interesting. I'd never thought about that before. And that is a bummer because mushrooms are so important. I mean, that role of decomposing stuff and turning, you know, waste products, which is just one of many things they do, into food, and cleaning things is just, and we don't even know how important that is. We're just starting to learn about that, and it's amazing. And yeah, what a bummer.
Well, it kind of stems from that, like the old belief of the hierarchy of life, where it's pretty much humans, animals, plants, then mushrooms. So I feel like that hierarchy is still related to snakes to the modern day. So. That's definitely part of it. Aside from the negative stuff, is just our sort of view that it starts with humans, and then that we can kind of work down from there. And I think, you know, a lot of those ideas that are starting to kind of change and not be talked about as much, like with you know, being top of the food chain and keystone stuff, that we're really starting to understand that it's definitely not all about us, at least not in a good way, and that all of these little things are so important, probably so much more important, just down to the things that we can't even see, like all the little microorganisms that live in the soil. That, I mean, it's just, you know, the diversity, like, we don't even know, but everybody depends on that. Yeah, instead of just like arbitrarily picking favorites to protect.
Mm-hmm.
Well, talking about this, do you have any stories about changing people's minds about snakes, and how would someone go about changing someone's mind?
Good question. So, it's tough. It's certainly easier to talk to young people who tend to not have sort of made up their mind about everything yet. Not that it's impossible to do with adults, but I've talked to lots of adults who had a positive experience with a snake when they were a kid and have told me about how that changed them. And so a lot of times that takes the form of their sixth grade teacher had a snake in the classroom, and just sitting there seeing that snake and how that snake didn't just spend all day trying to attack everyone really changed their mind. Like, that went against everything they had heard before that. And then anything they heard later about snakes being this or that, they're like, well, I know that's not true because I had that good experience. And so a lot of times just showing people or telling them, but especially if you can show them either with a real snake, or like we try to do it a lot with our videos, this is what snakes are really doing. That 5-second shot that you saw on the Discovery Channel of the rattlesnake, like flying open mouth, venom dripping thing at the screen before it attacked that poor little bunny, that's such a tiny part of their life. Let's watch this video of mommy rattlesnake defending her babies from a rock squirrel. Or let's watch this video of two snakes fighting each other, which, that isn't necessarily them being nice or really having anything to do with people, but just snakes being snakes and not being these, crazy monsters that we've sort of made them out to be. A lot of times that it just makes people think about them a little differently. And my favorite example, but not the only one, of a mind that at least started to be changed was I took when we lived at and worked at this nature preserve. There was a group of Boy Scouts that came out. They were going on a backpacking trip, but before they left for their trip, I took the group out because they had arrived, and I was like, hey, it's kind of on the way down the trail where you're going. I'm going to radio track this, I think it was one of our black-tailed rattlesnakes. I think it was Jaden. So I was like, do you guys want to come along, and then you can just, keep on hiking from there. And so they did. And as we were going out to track the snake, I'm telling them all these stories about Jaden, because at that point we had been following him around for, several months. So, and we lived there too. So we pretty much checked on him every day. So we knew him pretty well. And so I had all these stories about Jaden doing this or that. And then I also just started talking about black-tailed rattlesnakes in general. And that was the first species of rattlesnakes where parental care was documented in the wild. And so I think I had mentioned that too. And so then we found Jade, I showed him to him, and everybody, the kids were commenting on how pretty he was and stuff. And then as they started to take off, the adult, the Cub Scout leader, like turned around and kind of took me aside, and he said, I'll be honest with you, like, rattlesnakes show up in my yard fairly often, and they've always gotten the shovel. And it doesn't seem like he scooped them up and escorted them off his yard. He means that he chopped their head off. And he said, but he's like, I don't know. I mean, I never really thought about them as just, being mothers. And he's like, I don't know. I'm not saying that I'm cool with having them in my yard, but it's just really making me think about them differently. And then he just, walked off. It was just like this little seed that maybe ended up doing nothing, but maybe it changed everything for all those snakes that showed up, and for because he's a Boy Scout leader, so he talks to a lot of young people every year. And so now maybe he'll talk about snakes a little bit differently because he's been introduced to a different idea. So when I think about how we can change how people think about snakes, and then therefore how they treat them, is I just try to get people to see snakes the way that I see snakes, as being, individual beings that are really not that different from like our dog and our cat. They have their own personalities. Each species has different traits. I mean, a snake isn't a snake, a rattlesnake isn't a rattlesnake, a black-tailed rattlesnake isn't a black-tailed rattlesnake. Like, they're all a little different. And they have all this stuff going on in their lives. They can have friends. They can live in social groups. They can be caring parents. I tend to focus on things like that because those are behaviors that we share with them. Like, we take care of our kids. We live in social groups. We have friends. We fight over access to females sometimes. Maybe that's not the best trait of humans, but it is one that we share with snakes. And it gets people to think about them in a different way. And I also tend to, when possible, like if the snake has a name, I use that name. And if they don't have a name, then I refer to them as them or she or him, depending on, what the sex of the snake is, instead of it, because they're not inanimate objects. And it's little things like that using names and referring to them the same way that we would refer to another human or a pet animal, just is a minor shift that I think starts the brain thinking in other ways of like how I might have been wrong about this, how there's maybe more to this creature than, what we saw in Django. Is that or
Rango?
Yeah.
I mean, personally, I'm kind of lucky in that regard because there's like a picture of 2-year-old me in the hallway just holding a garter snake and like a kitty.
Oh, nice.
I've kind of always been around them, so I've never had a fear of them, and I'm happy for that because I feel like it makes me a better person than what the other end would be. So, yeah, personally.
I think it does too.
Yeah, I mean, Miles, I wouldn't be talking to you if you didn't like snakes. Let's put it that way.
I mean, yeah, if I gave him the shovel, I don't think I would still be friends. So.
It would make this conversation a bit different.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe I wouldn't invite you to come and be in the conversation with us.
Let's see. Another question. How can the average person help advocate for snake preservation, and what can we do in our own communities to help protect snakes?
Good question. So I think that we often underestimate the power of stories. A lot of times people think to change other people's minds, and especially for those of us who are like interested in science, like we want to throw a bunch of facts at them. So what I used to hear people do more often is, quote a bunch of figures about like, well, one snake will eat 10 mice a year, and 10 mice, if left to breed, will turn into, and I'm just making these numbers up, all of them, will turn into 1,000 mice, and that will destroy 100 pounds of grain or something, which could feed starving kids and blah, blah, blah. So that's just like, it's a lot of numbers. It's very impersonal. And it often, especially when it's an emotional issue, and a lot of the apprehension about snakes is based on emotions, fear and hate, and especially fear and misunderstanding. It's hard to fight that with facts and figures. Like that doesn't change the heart. And it's like, yeah, but they're scary and I don't like them. And a lot of times that's going to be people's reaction to anything you say about snakes. They're scary and I don't like them. But, I've found, and we're now working with a graduate student who's doing a study on this to see if the way that we talk about snakes does have a bigger positive impact than doing the kind of facts and figures thing. So it'll be cool to actually have some scientists to say, some science to say one way or another. But yeah, so we use a lot of stories, and this is, advocates have found that this works on a lot of other issues too, especially dealing with human stuff. If you can illustrate an issue with one story about how it's affecting one family or one person. And so the snake example of that is oftentimes just making them more familiar, telling a story or showing someone a story about a snake that isn't something scary to a human happening. And so You know, that could be in the form of, if you want to, you may have your own stories. You know, I was out hiking. There were stories at the very beginning of this stream here where somebody, you know, talked about finding a shed out in their garden, or I found a garter snake swimming in my backyard the other day. And that's kind of, you know, the end of it. It's not anything fantastic, but just hearing, if you can't get someone to experience for themselves that non-threatening interaction with the snake, oftentimes just sharing a story about that. And, you know, so it can be an interaction you've had with one, or maybe it was just something cool you saw, just to show people that finding, you know, your path crossing with a snake is not going to end in somebody dying. It doesn't have to end in somebody dying or getting hurt. Like, it can just be this really fun, interesting, like that sort of enthusiasm it's often very contagious for people. I found it really hard for people to keep on talking about how they want to kill the snakes, even though I've had people come over and start telling me that once I, you know, just start talking about, you know, these different behaviors about snakes, and especially, again, like using names and talking about them like they're individuals instead of just things. There's like little subtle things that I think can make a huge difference. And that's something that we could all do. You don't need to be a scientist doing research or reading other people's research. You know, you may have your own stories of encounters with snakes, and it could even be an encounter with somebody's pet snake. You know, it doesn't have to be a wild snake. I think a lot of times it's more impactful if it's a wild snake, because that, you know, wild is scary, scarier than a pet. But, you know, it could be sharing a story that you heard from watching a show or a video on YouTube, a good video on YouTube.
I don't have any on the top of my head right now, to be honest. I'm kind of wringing dry. But
well, I think we're gonna go on until 6:45 Eastern time, and then after that we'll wrap up the stream. And yeah, but for now, does anybody in the chat have any more questions to fire at our resident snake expert? If not, we can just. I mean, I guess it's story time then. Yeah, the reason why I asked about snakes being territorial earlier is that I noticed there was this one snake there was just this one snake around my house in the yard that, like this spot by the pond, it was a little garter snake, and it has a very distinct, like, checkered pattern in it. And I guess it's the only snake I've really seen around my house. It's a very distinct little individual. I know there's a couple other snakes at the school. They're differently patterned, and I don't know. I feel I know the different individuals. I was wondering, because I'm actually living pretty. I can speak, I swear. I talk too fast when I get excited, but I actually live really close to the school, and so it wouldn't be unreasonable for those snakes to have met or something. But they tend to stay like really far apart, and they stay in their own respective little zones, I guess. And I don't know. I feel like that if they were territorial, it might inhibit their chance of survival or something, because, you know, they need to mate. But I don't know. That's just kind of the situation that kind of set up my question earlier. This is going kind of nowhere.
Yeah, totally. I think, you know, scientists often use the word territorial a little different than other people, and so it's kind of confusing. And I'm not actually sure what the official definition of it is. Doing air quotes so no one can see. But you know, like, snakes do have, and as far as we know, this hasn't been studied in everybody, but I imagine it's true, because it's just something that makes sense for any animal, including humans. They have a territory. So they have a place where they live. This is their home, much in the same way that we have a home, you know, whether it's your neighborhood or, for the last year, many of us, it's just strictly been our house. And in that territory, you know, they have their place where they spend the winter, if they live in a part of the world that has to deal with winter. They have a place where they often encounter a female, if there's a male. And I guess for female, where males often encounter them, they have that place. If if they're females, you know, they'll have a certain place where they know it's a good spot to have a nest if they're egg layers, or a place to nest if they're giving birth. So you will often see like an individual, you know, it kind of depends on how big the territories are of the snakes where you live, how many different kinds you have, how far they have to travel to get all those things. You know, we were living at the nature preserve that was a literal desert oasis. There was running water there year round. There were hot springs, much like the golf course, except in a natural setting where they weren't getting persecuted. There's just tons of wildlife there. And so in that spot, it's like, yeah, we would see, there was a handful of snakes that lived right around our houses and headquarters in the visitor center. And, you know, you would see them almost every day. And there were several, because it was just such a lush, productive environment that it could absolutely support 5 or 6 large Western diamondback rattlesnakes. They were all eating the same thing because they're all the same size, so probably eating the same thing, and kind of living like home ranges right on top of each other. And if food was a little more scarce, they would probably have to spread out a bit more because there's just not as much room. So that kind of thing affects like how much they're overlapping. But certainly, like, you know, where I live now, it seems like there's just a couple individuals of any species of snake that ever come through our yard. And, you know, I think they also still have overlapping home ranges, but it's just food is harder to come by here. So they're covering greater distances, and we just don't see them at once.
Also, curious, Emma, where are you drawing right now?
It's
there
supposed
species
to be a white-lipped python. I'm just marking the scales in pink for now, and I'll make them rainbow later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I was kind of curious.
Yeah, no, it's a secret rare species of polka dot snake, obviously.
I think Julie is killing your Wi-Fi.
I think she is. She's playing Genshin Impact across the hall, and that thing destroys the Wi-Fi. I keep telling her, Julie, when I'm streaming, please don't play Genshin Impact. And I'm on 2 bars of Wi-Fi right now streaming to the world, and it's like, please, can I please stream?
I can't imagine having internet good enough where you could even think about doing 2 things like that at once. We would be done for the month.
Supposedly, my mom wanted to upgrade the Wi-Fi when quarantine hit, because, you know, we'd have to do school Zooms and all that. But I don't think it ever actually happened. So my dad will be in a conference call. My sister will be playing a video game that destroys every single person's Wi-Fi in the house, and I'll be trying to sit through a class like I can hear every 5th word.
Yeah. We do have another question in chat, and it's about snakes protecting their territory. And if snakes fought over territory one year, would they be able to end up friends the next?
Good question. So this wasn't a territory fight per se, but it is a story or an example about fighting snakes. So video, I think it's on our YouTube. It's one of the videos that we have of rattlesnake combat, and this is between 2 male Western diamondback rattlesnakes, and their names were Henry and Four. Four wasn't really his name. We never gave him an actual name, but so we came across them one day. There was this big pile of, this was at the nature preserve again, there was this big pile of manure because they also kept horses and burros and stuff there. And the rattlesnakes loved hanging out on this manure pile, which sounds disgusting, but it was open, and in the spring, like early parts of the year and times of day when it was cooler, the manure, as it decomposed, would form heat. So it's kind of like this giant heating pad. So it often attracted the snakes. They would just hang out on there. And one time, like walking by this manure pile, Henry and Four, who the day before had been hanging out near the manure pile, just hanging out there, this day they were fighting. They were in full-on combat. This was one of the times when I saw a rattlesnake. Henry bit himself in the bottom of his chin during that fight. He still won, though, because he was the best Western diamondback. He was a great snake. And it was because there was a female in the bushes nearby that they were fighting over. So not only had they been hanging out on that manure pile like just the day before that fight, they also shared a den over the winter. And so they were cool with sharing that den. So it was real. And I think this just speaks to the nature of, at least in this species of snake, they will fight over females, but it's just that. And there's not, you know, that female's gone, that mating opportunity's gone. They're like back to being, you know, I don't know about friends. We didn't study them in that way. But, you know, they would share these sites and tolerate each other being like pretty close, as long as there weren't females involved.
Reminds me of some people I know.
Yeah, no, they're really more like us than.
This question might overlap with what do you find the most interesting species of snake, but what's your favorite snake and why?
Good question. So I'm not going to go with Arizona black rattlesnakes again, even though it's really easy. It's hard. So my favorite snake, individual snake, is going to be pipsqueak, who is our gopher snake. That's one of our teachers' outreach animals that I take to schools and stuff. So as far as like individual snake, that's him, because he is, I used to refer to him as like the puppy dog of snakes, but he is way more tolerant of people and nicer and more trustworthy around little kids than like any dog that I have ever met. Like, he never bites. He loves kids. He loves being handled. He just like thrives on attention. I think quarantine was harder on him than it was on us, because he hasn't been out to do a public thing. I mean, it's been like a year and a half now, because they were still in hibernation when quarantine started last March. So it's been a long time since like 2019 that he's been able to see anybody but me and Jeff. So he's my favorite individual snake, but it's hard to pick a favorite snake species because there's so many and they're all so cool. And it's like asking someone to pick their favorite kid, although I did just very easily pick pipsqueak over the biting hognose. That was an easy choice. But I think, so pipsqueak is a gopher snake, and they are certainly one of my favorites, and probably my favorite, at least at the moment, non-rattlesnake. And I'm not sure exactly why. I really fell in love with them when we were working in that site in California, even though we had them in southern Arizona where I'd worked before, and they're fabulous. So there's a gopher snake or a close relative in most places in the U.S., although I'm not sure about Massachusetts. I think in the Northeast, they're pine snakes for where they are. I know they're in Jersey, and then, I'm not sure about Massachusetts. In the Southeast, they're pine snakes. In the middle of the country, they're bull snakes. And then mostly in the West, they're gopher snakes. And those lines aren't real firm, but they're all, they're large, harmless, pretty friendly, constricting snakes. And when I say large, the name gopher comes from that they can eat gophers. They in girth are, I don't know, some of the big ones probably have a diameter of 4 inches at their fattest. Like I'm used to being able to use my hands and show people, but that doesn't work on audio. And they can get to be over 6 feet long and pretty beefy snakes. So they're large, but they're just they're generally pretty docile. They just seem very curious and intelligent. Like the few times, and it's tough to do because they are scared of us, but the few times I've been able to watch one like kind of crawling around and seemingly trying to figure stuff out, like this gopher snake that shows up in our yard once a year or so that we know of, who we named Abby. She really wanted to get up. Our house is 2 stories. It's really large, and the walls are rock. So it is something a snake can climb, but it's very tall. And watching that snake like try to find this place, it's probably the same place she uses every year to get up into the roof, because there's a lot of little chipmunks and paramyscus, like field mice that live in and out of our house, unfortunately. but watching that snake like try to figure out what was the best way to get up there, that if she messed up that calculation and she fell, it would probably have killed her, because it was very stressful as a human to watch, before I realized that this is the same snake who had been in our yard almost exactly a year before, and she probably did this every year and knew exactly what she was doing, and we didn't need to run underneath her with a sheet to catch her just in case she fell. It was kind of silly. Gopher snakes are also the one, bull snakes, pine snakes, part of their defensive display is to coil up like a rattlesnake. They'll rattle their tail against the ground, and depending on what they're sitting in, especially if you haven't heard a lot of rattlesnakes, it kind of sounds like a rattle. They also have this flap of skin at the opening to their epiglottis, and when they blow air out, it goes, this tiny little flap of skin will go back and forth, and it makes this really loud hissing noise that, again, if you haven't been around a lot of rattlesnakes, people think it sounds like a rattle or like a rattlesnake, because in Western movies, rattlesnakes are always hissing, even though like they rarely do that. And they never do it like this. And they'll flatten their head out to make it triangular shaped like a rattlesnake, which is probably a really good defense against everything but humans, because humans are like, a rattlesnake, get the shovel, unfortunately. But gopher snakes they're up there for favorite. I like them a lot.
Let's see. Oh yeah, I do have a question. Do gopher snakes burrow at all, or is it just based off prey?
So I know that they will go into holes that other animals have made, because I've seen them do it to hunt. Like there was one that we watched kind of like poking his head in and out of different holes, like he was looking for something. Some pine snakes will dig to build, like they will, at least some of them in some places, nest communally, and they build their nest together with a series of like burrows and like piling together like some nesting material, which that would be a dream to see. It's like, a bunch of gopher snakes like cooperatively building a nest together. Oh my God, this is amazing. So yeah, kind
of. Let's see. We have another question. What are some common things people do with their pet snakes, see on social media that might actually be harmful? And they give one example of how there's pictures of geckos sitting like humans and the position hurts their spine.
Ooh, yeah, that doesn't sound like that'd be fine for a gecko. I know my cat eats that. Oh, it's a good question. I try not to look at a lot of stuff like that on social media. So honestly, like, since I'm sure there are things that people are doing with their pet snakes that are probably not great. I mean, a big problem with a little less so pet snakes, but those who are like keeping them for breeding them or shipping them around and stuff, are just putting them in really small, boring cages. So there's this old idea that a big cage would be scary to a snake, like because they do like to hide in tight, dark, secure spots, like under a rock or in a burrow. It's somehow that got translated into like that's all they need. And again, like, yeah, they do that, but they also crawl around, and some of them travel great distances over the course, throughout their home range. And just because we don't understand how they communicate and think and problem solve and interact with each other doesn't mean that those things aren't important to them. And so I think a lot of time, and I was guilty of this for sure when I first started keeping snakes, just sort of giving them the minimal, a place to hide, a water bowl, and a cage that's like half their body length where they can like kind of get long but not totally straight. And it's just not fair for them. And they're a lot more interesting to have as a pet, although never as interesting as they are in the wild. Even my lovely pit snake they get ever more interesting, and I think are probably much happier when they have, a more interesting setup. So more places to hide, maybe even though they don't need those special lights that imitate the sun like lizards do, or they'll end up with bone issues. You know, one of my rat snakes, like she was a much more beautiful color when I kept her under one of those lights. And, you know, just kind of seemed like happier and more content, and giving them things to climb on, even if they're not a species that you think might like that. Multiple places to hide, different kind of substrates. Our rosy boa, which is another one of our educational animals, rosy boas are not known to climb trees. Like, they live in the rocks, they live in the desert. They're not known to be arboreal. They don't look like something that should be climbing. He climbs all the time. He loves his little branches and trees, like more than our arboreal snakes. So I think that's something, it's not something I've seen a lot on social media, just something I noticed. But I see on social media people doing the snakes a lot that I think they don't like. And I have also been guilty of this just in general too. I love snakes. And when it's non-venomous, like, I want to pick them up because I love picking them up. And they don't like that. They think that means they're going to die. Because when you're a wild animal and somebody grabs you, like, you're going to die. You're about to get eaten. The only time that happens, especially when it's another species and that other species is bigger. And, you know, I think for a lot of people, they think that handling a wild animal is showing somebody that might be scared. They're like, oh, look, it's fine. See, I'm not getting bit. But for someone who's really scared, they're just like, no, you are crazy. That's why you're doing that. And the snakes are, you know, they're terrified, and I don't know. And it also just makes for a pretty boring interaction because, you know, the snake's going to be scared. It's probably going to poop on you. It may even try to bite you. Whereas if you left it alone, sometimes you get to see them do something cool, like climb up your 2-story house.
Let's see.
All right. Well, we are nearing the end, so we got
You have
one
one
last
more
question. Yeah.
Do animals often use mimicry to copy snakes? And they knew the example of the burrowing owl making a sound like a rattlesnake, or king snakes copying the coloration of coral snakes.
Yeah, that's a good question. And yeah, so I think there is some there's some discussion about this on whether king snakes and milk snakes are copying the coloration of a coral snake to make things think that they look like coral snakes, or if it's because that coloration is just actually kind of surprisingly, since they're so bright. If you're not familiar, we're talking about animals that are bright red, bright black, bright yellow in some differing amounts and bands and patterns. That kind of coloration, especially when they're moving, makes them really hard to see. It's called flicker fusion. And so there's some discussion among evolutionary biologists as to what the reason for, and if that mimicry has a benefit. And it has been shown to in some places, does offer some benefit with, like, predators, especially birds, being less likely to grab something that looks like a coral snake than they are with a similar shape and size, but not colored like a coral snake. The only other example I can think of, and I'm sure that I'm missing some, there is a moth, I think, that I think it's some sort of moth or butterfly. When its wings are up, it looks just like the head of an arboreal snake, one of those like vine snakes. It looks so much like it. I remember seeing a picture and I was just like, that's a cool snake. Oh, that's not a snake.
Hawk moth caterpillar.
Yes, thank you.
I think that is it. I remember seeing it before. Like, I had a picture in my head, I just couldn't remember the name.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing. Like, it looks so much like that. Yeah, and I would imagine that it could possibly be because that's good camouflage, but man, it really does look like a little snake face, and something that a lot of animals are probably much less likely to bite than.
It looks exactly like it, yeah.
All right. Well, looks like we're hitting the end of the stream. I want to thank everybody for attending. I will draw the winner of the raffle for the Tail of Scales deck shortly, and you will get an email back if you won the raffle. So thank you for submitting. And yeah, I also want to thank Miles and Melissa for joining me on the stream today, because without them, I would have been awkwardly blubbering and drawing.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I mean, I can only imagine trying to do this and draw would be a lot.
Oh, yeah.
It'd be difficult, yeah.
All right, well,
All right.
thanks for coming, everybody. I'm going to take us off air in 3,